Welcome, everybody. I'm Todd Nilson, one of the volunteer organizers for the Catalyzing the Future event. We're really glad you're able to join us for the afternoon stream. I see a few people who are filtering in right now to watch this event. I am particularly excited because I get to duck out from behind the scenes here to interview our next guest for the mid-afternoon conversations about getting real about the future. Michelle Walker. Michelle got tired of hearing people insist that they never saw it coming when so many often don't see the dangers and sound the alarm of trouble coming their way. So she coined the term gray rhino to draw attention to the highly probable risks, that high impact risks that everyone hates to admit that we neglect. She introduced the concept at the World Economic Forum's 2013 annual meeting in Davos, and then trained people in and developed gray rhino theory, making it part of the influential international bestseller, The Gray Rhino: How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore. Really happy to have Michelle here. I understand she's working on a new book and she may be able to share a couple of details about that with us. I'm going to add her to the stream right now. Welcome, Michelle. So nice to see you.
Great to be here.
Really glad you're able to join. I think maybe just to get started, Michelle, what is a gray rhino in your own words?
So the gray rhino is a thing you imagine in front of you. It's 2 tons plus. It's got a big old horn, very dangerous, pointed right at you. It's pawing the ground, it's snorting, it's angry, it's getting ready to charge at you. And it gives you a choice. You can get out of the way, you can get trampled, or you can hop on the back of the and do something with all of this energy. I get people to picture it right in front of you, but the truth is it could actually be further down the road or on the hill. In many cases, it's easier to deal with when it's farther away. But the point is really to imagine something, to draw an emotional connection with this big, obvious thing that's coming at you. And it's so rhino, because obviously it's dangerous, it's the horn, it's big and scary. It's gray because there were 5 rhino species, one of which is the black rhino, which is not black. The other one is the white rhino, which is, of course, not white. They're both gray, which is kind of the obvious thing, right? Except we don't talk about it. We call it by something that it's not. And so that sort of reinforced the metaphor. And it was partly a reaction to this black swan metaphor, which was something that you just, exists, but it's just so far out of your realm of imagination, you can't even picture it. And people use that a lot to, it really is a cop-out, for things that they should have seen coming, that some people saw coming and yelled and screamed about, but, people kept their heads in the sand. It's also a distant relative of the elephant in the room, another large endangered animal. But the thing about the elephant in the room is that by definition, it just stands there. And the concept normalizes this idea that people don't do anything, they don't say anything. The thing just kind of stands there and it doesn't move. And so it's not dynamic and it doesn't really give you a sense of agency. And the gray rhino is really a challenge. I use it to draw attention to how much more likely we are than we'd like to think that we ignore these things. But the truth is there actually are people who don't ignore them, who do something about them. And I want to celebrate those people, understand what the difference is between the people who see something and act and the people who don't.
And I'll mention another animal metaphor that people may be thinking of in the back of their minds. There's the book, The Black Swan, or Black Swan Events, that I don't know if it was coined by Nicholas Taleb. I think it was.
There was a couple of other people who used it, Karl Popper and some people, ancient Greece, but he was really the first one to use it in the markets context. And of course, this book came out in 2007 as the subprime crisis was starting to unravel. And so in 2008, there were, of course, all these policymakers who ignored all the warnings from the Bank for International Settlements. The FBI even was warning about, mortgage fraud. And a lot of people used it as a cop-out, as an excuse to, why they lost money, why policymakers weren't on top of this. And so it was really badly misused. And there were a lot of people who used it to try to hide the fact that some people did see something coming. And it also is this sort of thing where these 25-year-old traders will come out and say, oh, black swan, nobody saw it coming, and then, move on. It's something you used to say, oh, I read that fat book that's really hard to read. And people didn't really apply it in a constructive way, although his central point was very relevant and important. It's that you do need to pay more attention to the possibility that you're going to get whipped upside the head. And you do need to think about having a reserve. You do need to think about resilience and strategies for that. But that's unfortunately not how most people use the concept.
So thinking about strategies, I think as you had put together the book around the Great Rhino, you outlined really 5 phases around a gray rhino approach or methodology. Could you maybe cover that for us and tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I started asking myself, why do people do something and why don't people do something when they see things coming? And I realized that it really depends on where you are in the state of the crisis. And each of these 5 stages helps you to understand the obstacles to doing something, and it helps you to formulate strategies. And you can apply it to yourself and your own organization. But it's also important to think about it more broadly, do a stakeholder analysis of everybody around you, the people who are affected by this or the people who have the power to fix it and who are doing things to contribute to the problem. So the 5 stages start with denial, and there's a bit of a nod to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of grief. These are a little bit different, but they were somewhat informed by that. So denial is the first one, and human nature is to deny things that are too big and scary for us to deal with, and it's a very sensible defense mechanism. It's reasonable. Like, you shouldn't beat yourself up for having it because it's what we do. In many cases, the death of a loved one or a war, a huge shock is so big that if you really absorb the whole thing at once, you would collapse. So on a certain level, denial is really good. I mean, and I'm like that. When I go through, shocks, I go through that numb stage. I remember a close friend of mine died when I was young, and it took me a while to actually cry and let it sink in. So it's protective. The problem is when you stay in that denial mode too long, it becomes very dangerous. The other part is that there are a lot of people who contribute to some of these problems. If you want to go up to the very top 30,000 foot level, climate change, but fossil fuel companies have a vested interest in people denying this, just as the tobacco companies did, and all of the other sorts of products that make people money, but whose downsides are bigger than the benefits that they give. And so there's something called manufactured denial, which is really when people take advantage of that, marketers, lobbyists, whatever, and they will seed misinformation, they'll distract us, they'll do everything they can to try to get people to stay in this denial stage. So most of the people, once they're dealing with my work, they're past that. So I don't spend lots of time there. The second one is muddling, otherwise known as kicking the can down the road. And that's when you say, yeah, I get that there's a problem, but we can't fix it because we don't have the budget, because the boss doesn't agree, because political will, because blah, blah, blah. All sorts of reasons why you can't fix it. And there's actually something I developed called strategic muddling, which is when you realize that, yes, you can't do something right away because maybe there's not the political will. I applied this a lot to democratization, to economic reform, things like that. You have a plan, you have it in place, and you do what you can to get yourself to the place where you're not muddling anymore, where you've got the preconditions. So that brings us to the next stage, which is diagnosing. And that's where you shift from all the reasons why you can't do something to what does it take to make this happen? What do I need and who can help me get it? Whose buy-in do I need? And that, interestingly, can lead to some very strange bedfellows. It also involves looking at what kind of rhino you're dealing with. Some things are, very, very obvious. Climate change, for example, very obvious. But the solution is very complicated. It's, people don't want to deal with it. There's something called solution aversion, where if people don't like the solution, they're not going to deal with it. how fast is it moving at you? How big is it? Who is it going to impact? Is it going to affect other issues? Going back to climate change again, partly because it's on my mind so much recently, but some of the efforts to reduce emission can also help health issues. I mean, I developed asthma after 9/11, so it's actually come back the last few years, and they say that the temperature changes are changing the pollen generation patterns and all of that. So if you address climate change, you're also going to have this great side effect of dealing with emissions and asthma, or you've probably seen the studies that came out and said that people in places with high pollution were actually more vulnerable to COVID, had worse outcomes. Go ahead.
So I have a question for you. So is something like climate change something that you would term? I saw you use in the book the word meta rhinos, right? Is that something that if you were able to address that particular rhino, that it would affect others that are maybe having an impact on us?
It definitely affects all sorts of things. It's part of an ecosystem. Actually, a herd of gray rhinos zoologically is called a crash. I see climate change as something that's very closely related to others. By meta rhinos, I mean more structural problems or decision-making problems. The meta rhino in the United States right now would be the complete breakdown of the political system, where it's so polarized and paralyzed. Or a lot of times in companies, you'll see that people don't understand the risk of not dealing with risks. Like they're more afraid of making the wrong decision to prevent a risk than they are of sitting still and ignoring it and getting flattened like everyone else. And diversity is a big part of the meta rhinos that we see. People being unwilling to listen to alternative points of view. So it's really the governance and the decision process. So
okay. Yeah. So I guess maybe then I'm thinking of this in terms of a crash of rhinos, that we have multiple kinds of rhinos that are surrounding us right now and maybe circling us in terms of COVID, social justice, disasters like the fires in California, like multiple things threatening us at the same time that were all predictable, but which are kind of hitting us as a crash.
Absolutely. And they're so closely related to each other. I mean, going into the pandemic, we had lots of financial fragilities, very closely tied to inequality. That you're seeing these huge asset bubbles that are making the gap between the rich and the poor bigger and bigger. And then that in turn is slowing economic growth, because the people who need the money to spend it are the ones who kind of keep the whole mechanism running. And climate change is so closely related as well, because the people who are likely to be hurt worst by climate change are generally not the ones who are producing the majority of emissions, whether it's individuals or countries. And then climate change in turn circles back to financial fragilities. You may have seen an increasing number of reports from central banks, from the CFTC a couple weeks ago, from investors coming out and saying, hey, there's a huge financial risk here from climate change, because insurance companies are not capitalized enough to handle the extreme weather events that are coming. The real estate industry is very vulnerable, because a lot of this, coastal real estate is high valued. 70% of the population is in cities, which are coastal. And, that's very vulnerable in municipalities. So not dealing with climate change has this whole other cascading set of financial effects that are very, very dangerous. And then on top of that, you look at the wildfires, or the droughts, and hurricanes, extreme weather. I mean, those are all the costs to those, any businesses in those areas. So the costs of not dealing with it are quite severe. And everyone whose opinion I respect in the financial world thinks that climate change is a very serious threat to our financial stability, which already is very tenuous, given you look at all the money we've had to print to deal with COVID, all of the the stimulus packages. So it's quite scary. And the other part about climate change is that it's releasing all of these pathogens from the permafrost. And so there's going to be more of these, scary bugs and things coming out that we didn't even know about.
So, Michelle, are we seeing, this concatenation of different problems resulting from maybe some higher level, disasters, gray rhinos, coming our way? Is this what we have to look forward to going forward? And how are leaders supposed to respond to that in a meaningful way? I understand, the response has been a little different globally from leaders in Asia versus, in the West. I'm kind of curious if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, climate change, for many people, there's sort of this sense of helplessness because it's so big. And you need everybody on the planet to be doing their part. And people feel like, what can I do as one little person? And a very important part of risk management is making people feel that they've got the power to do something. Project Drawdown is this fantastic organization that's come up with a list of all sorts of things that can be done, whether at the government level or at the business level or individual level. In the individual level, things like, changing your diet, taking more public transportation, making sure your insulation in your home is good. And so there's a report looking at 30 of those, which are just behavioral things that you can do. And they estimated that depending on how many people adopt these, we could actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by between 20% and 37%, which is pretty darn impressive, if you ask me.
Extraordinary, right?
It really is. So when these people come out, I see all these stories by these, young kids where their editors said, go out and do something counterintuitive. And they say, oh, you're a sucker if you switch to a plant-based diet. You're a sucker if you switch to public transportation and give up your car or do all these things that save the environment, because it's not going to make any difference. And besides, the more you do, the less corporations have to do, which, one, isn't true. And two, yes, corporations have designed some of these campaigns to get people to take some responsibility for things. And, they benefit from that. But the truth is, the more people are doing those things, the more corporations take notice. And the more they market to that and they design their products to that, and the more they design their governance to that. So it becomes a virtuous circle as opposed to the vicious circle, which is what we've got right now.
Wonderful. So Michelle, in the time that we've got left here, I'm kind of curious, as you've been thinking and writing and speaking about, gray rhinos over the past couple of years, how has your thinking changed? Maybe how's the world evolving? I know you've got another book coming out soon. What's on your mind these days?
Wow. Well, first of all, how much COVID has drawn attention to how important risk is in our life and how important individuals are in that. You look at all of the individual risk decisions when you walk down the street. Are you going to wear a mask or not? What about all the people around you? I took the L in Chicago for the first time about a month ago, and there were people with the mask hanging down over their nose, or no mask at all, or a bunch of teenagers with no mask, and blah, 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 blah. I changed cars like 5 times on the way back, and I'm never, ever going to take the L again until things are much better. So it's, that individual risk perception is a lot about what I'm writing about in the new book, which is called You Are What You Risk. It's coming out next April. There's a lot on psychology and culture, some of these influences, but also on how the sort of risk umbrella that our governments create over us and the sort of risk ecosystem that they create determines how many good or bad risks we're going to take. And you look at things like investing in a college education. There's a question: is that risk worth it? Are you going to do the thing that's good or not? Who in society is worth taking a risk on? Who gets that credit and who doesn't? And all of those things coming together, the big picture risk umbrella and risk ecosystem affect our individual decisions, which in turn feedback up to the whole economy and how well off we all are. So I think we need to really rethink how each of us address risk individually, but also how governments do it, and communities and businesses. Whose responsibility is it? And let's all step up.
It's really interesting, and I like going back to that idea of the creating virtuous cycles. Have you seen any kinds of encouraging steps or motions between governments and corporations and individuals happening so far that give you hope or a sense of what's the direction of the future for creating those kinds of more beneficial risks than the ones that I guess we are at a point now where we're questioning what's a good risk versus a bad risk. This is the time we need to be asking those questions.
Absolutely. Well, Iceland just came out with an agreement a few days ago between the government and the finance industry to work on dealing with climate change. And this idea that everybody's got to work together is so important. In this country, you're starting to see, investors and central banks coming out and saying, hey, the money is important, and individuals making their own steps. Here in Chicago, we've got too much water rather than too little. And, you're seeing people putting together their own, rain gardens and trying to make all of those little changes that need to happen. So we've got a long way to go. But I think that we're the good thing, the silver lining of the coronavirus, and the silver lining is a very small part of the bad stuff. Don't get me wrong.
Little sliver of silver, right?
It's really sliver, but you got to look for it. It's that people are paying a lot more attention to these obvious problems that we've been ignoring, neglecting, downplaying, whatever, because we've seen the price of not listening to, Bill Gates when he says we're not prepared for the next pandemic, not listening to all of the public health officials who've said, hey, we need to be more prepared. Not just longer term, but immediately. Once we saw Italy and China having problems, why weren't we on top of getting PPE right away? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's still a lot of denial out there. And it's very hard because, a lot of times the people who are denying the most are the ones who are the most scared. And so we need to learn to recognize our fear and vulnerability. And instead of just shutting it out, step up to it and say, hey, yeah, I'm human. I'm vulnerable. It's okay. We're all human. And yes. Once we recognize that, we're stronger because we can do something about it.
I'm reminded of one of my heroes, and I'll probably be teased a little for it, but Mr. Rogers, saying that feelings are mentionable, right? And by mentioning, how we feel, by talking about how we feel, that allows us to share a great many things and express our vulnerabilities and our worries, so that we can do something about them, right?
And his whole neighborhood concept is actually very important because risk taking is very personal to each of us. It's our fingerprint. It's what defines us, but it's also so closely related to the people around you. When you have a support system, you can take more good risks, and you also feel safer when you're all facing bad risks like COVID together.
Michelle, great place to leave it. Thank you so much. Michelle Walker, author of The Gray Rhino, with an upcoming book on uncertainty and risk coming out in April. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the great conversation. It's been fun.
Right. And we'll be back in just a few moments here for the next panel in the afternoon. Thank you for coming.
Well, hey.
Hi.
Hello, everybody.
Just starting to panic then. Just starting to panic.
Oh,
I think we're game to proceed with this. So welcome, everybody, and welcome to this Catalyzing the Future panel. I'm the moderator for this short discussion amongst giants. We have 4 incredible panelists, 4 incredible minds here, and moderating this and trying to get everybody's discussion in within 40 minutes is going to be completely impossible. So I'm going to be quiet and just introduce myself as Nigel Thurlow. I am the creator of Scrum, the Toyota Way, and also the co-creator of something called the Flow System. But my role today is to help you bring your opinions across. I'm going to ask you all to make a very rapid 1-minute introduction. I'm going to start with Andy because she's sitting right next to me. Andy, welcome. You're on mute. Can't hear you, Andy. So while you sort that out, let's jump to Ellen. Ellen, let's bring you in for a quick introduction.
All right. Ellen Grace Henson, marketing mechanics, inventor of the Wheel of Value,
Can you hear me now?
think tank, and more.
Yes.
Keep going, Ellen.
You can hear me now.
So I help clients, I help companies of all sizes help ensure that they are customer-centric, employee-centric, and wildly successful in delivering value to their customers.
Whoa. So, Andy, let's cut back to you and get your introduction. I can hear some music somewhere, but Andy, if you can give us your introduction without the music.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. I think Andy's having some troubles. Ilkka, let's bring you in. Ilkka, you're in Finland. Let's learn a little bit about you, if we can do.
yes, my name is Ilkka Kakko, and my colleagues call me Ike, or sometimes they call me with my Twitter name, which is Serendipitor. I live in Finland, countryside, but I work globally, mostly on developing innovation environments. I work with science and technology parks in developing in Europe. I have been an advocate for 3 things: for serendipity thinking, for post-normal era, which we, by the way, are entering now very rapidly, and VUCAbility, where VUCAbility is the ability to prosper in VUCA conditions, so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world where we are now. And I wish I can bring some Scandinavian and Finnish perspective to this discussion. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely, Ilkka.
Is the music off?
Andy, the music's off. That's perfect. What a great segue. Andy, say hello to everybody who's listening in.
Oh, God.
You can't hear me. Martin, would you like to jump in while we figure out what until Andy can hear us? Martin, you're the best dressed amongst us.
Well, I made an effort. I put a shirt on instead of the usual scrubs. Yeah, I'm Martin Knox. I have a one-liner because it's been difficult. Yeah, it's been difficult for me to describe what it is that I did. I was at an event some years ago, and there was someone wanted to meet me, and I knew of this person's reputation. She had a very particular reputation. Anyway, I saw this vision being wheeled across the room to me, and she came to me, shook hands, and she stood up a little bit taller, and she looked down her nose at me, and she said, "Hey, what do you do then?" And before I could even think, I said, "It's difficult to describe what it is that I do, but I'm fucking good at it. I have a one-liner. I work with leaders and their organizations to help them find, articulate, and deliver their truth."
Wow,
So
that's a wonderful introduction. And so we've lost Andy, but I think she's sorting out her technical problems. We'll come back in. So I'm going to press on. So today we're going to discuss a few ideas. I've got a few ideas to probably discuss with you, the panel, but the focus really is what can we do rather than just what we think today. So not just theories and academia, but some practical suggestions from those who are looking for us. Andy, can you hear us? Can we hear you? No. Your microphone isn't working. No.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, perfect. Don't do anything. Touch nothing. Please just quickly.
Is agility at its best?
This is a shallow dive into chaos, which is perfect for this
I'm
panel.
so sorry. I had no idea where the music was coming from. I couldn't figure out anything. I shut down. Shall we continue? I don't want to interrupt us. Where were we?
No, Andy, we were just about to move to a first question, but please, in sort of 20 words or less, tell us who you are.
I'm an agile corporate anthropologist, figuring out how to solve complex problems to help organizations change and the people inside them. Change is terribly painful and nobody likes me, but I'm here. So I'd love to talk today about business and agility. Thank you for having me and being patient.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And for everybody's benefit, she is an award-winning author as well. She's a wonderful person. I enjoyed talking to her the other day in great detail. So we're just saying that we want to try and give some practical advice today as to what people can take away from this. And my first sort of supposition to you all is normal an illusion? We keep talking about this new normal, but was there ever an old normal? What is normal anyway? I don't know. Who wants to pick that up and run with it? Martin.
Sorry. It's a word I want to ban because it's utterly meaningless. Normal. What does it mean? It is entirely contextual, and it's in here. It doesn't exist anywhere else. My supposed normal is completely different to somebody else's. This massive rush to getting back to business as normal.
Ilka, take it and run with it. Mute off and grab it.
We're looking for the familiar, and we're coming out into the world and not finding it. There's no normal. There never has been.
Martin, hold that thought. Ilka, what do you want to add?
That's why, Martin, that's why I call it this time what we are living now, post-normal, when nothing is normal anymore. So that's kind of my understanding about normal or not normal. But this is post-normal. And of course, we have very many fundamental changes going on now, which we will talk maybe in a minute.
I can see Ellen is eager to grab hold of those thoughts. Ellen.
Well, so normal is actually a mathematical concept. It's similar to average, and I agree with Martin and Ilka. In a concrete sense, it doesn't exist. It's just a way we simplify the world to give ourselves some comfort. There's always chaos. There's always change. So we want to be careful about getting too comfortable with any particular situation. When we talk about business and agility, we really want to structure our work to support change. The markets change around us, the worlds change around us, and we want to have the structure in our work and in our relationships to be able to respond effectively and positively to that change.
I think that was good. And Andy, what do you want to add to that?
So let's get a little bit of the neurosciences in here. The way our brain works is it takes data and information and it creates a story. And by the time you hit 25 or 30, you have a pretty good illusion of reality. And once you have that story in your head, we live our stories, you only see the things that conform to that story. And our amygdala loves to hijack anything. It fears it, it flees it, it appeases it. But the oldest reptilian part of the brain hates the unfamiliar. And so consequently, you don't see anything. And if you don't see it, we decide with the heart and the eyes, and then the brain comes in. And so whether Martin is right, there's no normal or it's a new normal, what we're looking for is what the brain wants, which is certainty. It wants autonomy. It wants us to be able to have fairness and relatedness. We want to be social. I'm an anthropologist, but at the end of the day, the brain is hating what's going on now. It just wants to do the same habits it's always had that worked. Well, it's not going to work anymore. So now how do we change the story to come up with a new one that'll help us see a new post-normal? But we're going to look for something that gives us certainty. I passed.
No, that was good because there was a comment from the audience saying if you're always focusing on normal, you're always catching up, which was and you have a fan out there as well, Andy, put a comment in while we're talking as well. So somebody's just saying, Richard Merrick saying normal is an anchor in the past. So if we start looking, because we are all agilists and we sort of work in this sort of business consulting world and helping teams and helping people, and if we're starting to want people to focus on something that isn't just normal standard average. One of the things I've been talking about a lot as an agilist and a lot of the people I talk to is about teamwork. And of course, agile folks are always talking about individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Well, as we move into this sort of post-COVID world, if we want to call it that, and we focus more on human factors and team science, I've sort of looked at all the frameworks out there. And they all talk about you need a team. Teams are awesome, but they don't actually teach you how to be a team and what teamwork really is. And we've got some really eminent people on this panel who are very focused on this. And of course, Andy, you're an anthropologist. So this is right in your course. So I'm going to start with you in a minute by asking this question. What thoughts have you got on effective teamwork in this virtual and rapidly changing world? Andy?
Well, I heard some research recently that all the folks from one of the large consulting businesses were all struggling with belonging and well-being. So humans are herd animals. We're most comfortable in social settings with others who look like us, talk like us, share our stories, and affirm to our brain that we're safe. Now the problem is that team has all kinds of different stories going on. They're all living remotely. They're dealing with it differently. And there's no platform for actually communicating over that, proverbial water cooler. And we haven't got new methods for sharing. And so we really don't know what our teammates are doing. So we make it up. And in the absence of their stories, we're creating new ones, which makes that team an illusion that we're trying to work with. And the fraction is a very interesting one because we have to rise to the occasion. We're like EMTs or a firehouse, and we have to know how to perform. We need a checklist. But if you think what airplane pilots do, they go through their checklist. Good surgeons go through their checklist. Now everything is without a checklist. So it's a very interesting time for creating a new normal with new rules, new checklists, new how-tos. But if you don't do it together, you're all going to be making up your own stories, and it will be such fun, but nobody will know what to do. So I pass my baton.
Who wants to pick that up? Martin?
Well, Andy, you used the word earlier on that really, really struck me. People looking for sameness.
Yes.
And that's I suppose that's key. Something that we can identify and recognize. Something that it goes beyond the familiar.
Yes.
Perhaps I don't know where I'm going with this. So, Ellen.
Are you familiar with the theme of willful blindness?
Oh, yeah.
So what you described,
I'm very good at it.
We willfully don't see stuff that doesn't fit. And however you want to share it, you do some marvelous work bringing teams together to be innovative and creators. And I bet you bring diverse teams together to do that. Because you're all pulling all those ideas into a new bucket and taking it up. But you have some wonderful approaches to how to build those teams.
Ellen, I think you wanted to add something there before we bring Ilka in. You were hovering there with a comment.
I always have. I mean, this is such an exciting conversation. It's hard to not want to, jump in and participate. It's interesting. There's two really critical failure points for teams, amongst many, but two critical failure points is a lack of clear goals and then a lack of alignment around those goals. So what breaks down oftentimes in the focus on individual performance is an understanding, something that's central to all of us that we can build our goals around. And in my work, I help my clients focus on their customer as central to the company and central to the performance of all teams. And then an appreciation and an understanding of what everybody brings to ensure the success of those goals, to ensure the success of the teams. I've been in tech for a long time, and I've worked with companies of all different types. And one of the things I see commonly is kind of a hierarchy, right? A hierarchy of value, Or even recently, I heard somebody say only sales and engineering contribute to revenue. Everybody else is overhead. That shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to deliver an awesome experience for your customers. It shows a fundamental disrespect for the work that everybody else in the company does. And it's probably one of the key drivers of why we have such a low engagement of employees throughout the world.
It's fundamental to the problems in the world right now. Sorry, Ilka.
Ilka, please come in.
I would like to highlight one of the, I would say, challenges in teamwork, and it's in the very beginning, and I think it's the team formation. How you formate teams, how you pick up the team members, and this kind of stuff. And I think the sameness and I said like domain-specific knowledge is mostly important, or seen important, mostly important thing. But you might miss some other things, like how some member of the team can bring some inspiration, different perspectives, this kind of things. And me being an advocate of serendipity, I like to see this kind of unexpected combinations of competencies to emerge. So unexpected combinations of competencies, that's something which I'm trying to get. And when I work with the ecosystem development and ecosystems, where there are a lot of free agents, so we can kind of formate teams which are more about the gravity of the idea and how the idea itself attracts people to work with that kind of idea. So it's a different kind of environment than in I would say, real enterprise environment. But I think this is one key element which has been missing team formation principles.
I'm sorry, Andy, please go ahead.
No, I'm listening. We have a lot of higher education institutions as our clients. And as soccer became a metaphor for how you live life, the faculty were having a terrible time with students who would only do things together in teams. And that often meant very poor performance because they knew how to play together on soccer, but not how to get things done together. And I think that's pretty much what you see in many organizations. Just a little side note to that, we have a leadership academy for a healthcare institution, and we're working on followership now. And we're talking less about teams because they're all working in different places, and more about how to get leaders and followers to get results collaboratively, because the team needs all of those. To your point, Ellen, they need the general manager as well as the players. So there's some interesting observations going on how these actually work, at least in our clients.
So I'll bring you in a second, Martin, because I was just listening to some of the comments and I was reading some of the comments on the screen, and a lot of people are sort of echoing some of the thoughts in their questions. Sai, our great founder and backer in the background, was going yes, yes, yes in the chat window, which nobody else can see, by the way. It's just for the panelists. And somebody was asking about team size in virtual teams, and there's a lot of science about team size and about when we study the sort of size of teams and their effective, be able to have shared mental models, cognitions, work together, etc., etc. And I won't go too deeply into that. And I think all the rules apply to team size, whether it's virtual or remote, but then or together, but the rules of collaboration and working together, they change when you're in this virtual environment. We have to make that extra effort, which brings me, and Martin, I'll bring you in immediately on this next point, is when we start to think about teams and members of a team, there's this whole concept of expertise and great expertise. And I was described by Dave Snowden, the Cynefin framework creator, as a great generalist. And I like that label. So is a generalist more valuable than an expert, especially in this new world? Or is there such a thing as an expert generalist? Martin, do you want to take us off on this one?
The experts have been vilified for the past, few years. And of course we need experts. And experts on occasion have been communicating very badly. The expert in her field can come over as very narrow in perspective. Of course you can have an expert generalist. The experts are still needed. The expert generalist can call upon the expertise of the expert. and put different aspects of expertise together in new ways. This is what we have to do, to face the challenges that we're facing.
Yep.
And I could go on and on and on. So I'm going to
somebody save him from going on and on and on and jump in. Who wants to follow Martin?
Well, I have a new book coming out, and of the 10 stories in there, one woman is a subject matter expert. And as we dug into the myths around roles, she was quite happy being a subject matter expert, being a specialist, and being called in to a team on the kinds of projects. MIT has some great research about assembling ad hoc teams of different folks with different expertise. And all of a sudden they have a problem to solve and did it extremely well, not even aware of how they did it, in a sense. They just, came together with different ideas, and the subject matter expertise was shared in a way that allowed them to come to great resolutions and then disband. And so the question about what size team is a really profound one, as if we have an assumption based on the past, where things were being done inside companies, inside buildings, not ad hoc. I mean, there's all kinds of new rules to the new post-mortem normal. Did I say post-mortem?
Maybe it will be. Ellen, did you want to add something? Because I know Ilka's definitely got some serendipitous comments here, but Ellen, would you like to contribute?
There's so many points to address here. So many wonderful points. I want to, Nancy Kress, thank you for your comment, Nancy. She said something about there's a willful blindness around customers as part of the team. Yep. Customers need to be part of and at the center of the work we do in business. There was a study published in Harvard Business Review several months ago asking people where they spend the most of their time in their work and which part and what time are they spending that they think is the most valuable for their work. So people spend the most time working within their discipline, but they get the most value, or they deliver the most value when they're working with people across other disciplines outside their discipline. That leads me then to Ilka's point about diverse perspectives leading to new insights. There's a lot of talk, of course, in business around innovation. And I find that in a lot of tech companies, the focus is on technical innovation. When you can get a cross-discipline team together, develop a shared understanding of the customer, help them articulate what the customer wants to accomplish at various points in that life cycle or the customer experience, and you're having this as a cross-discipline conversation, incredible synergies arise and incredible insights into better ways to collaborate to deliver that value, better ways to create that value. Innovation abounds. And it does take that comfort, that understanding that we're all bringing something to this space, and that respect for what people bring, and then that willingness to listen and to hear, to discover new ways to work more effectively together.
Ellen, there's so many amazing points you're making, which really lend themselves to my studies in team science. But Ilka, I'm really interested in that Finnish serendipitous a perspective that I know you bring on this point.
I hope it will be global perspective as well. But in a way, I would like to say about my good friend Kenneth Mikkelsen, who was writing a book about neo-generalists, and reading that, I got the insight and linking with the serendipity. I think it is that in many cases, the domain-specific experts are so deep in their specific theme, and they matter of understanding that they don't have this kind of serendipitous mindset, so they don't like surprises. So I feel like I work very closely, and I enjoy working with people who like surprises. And I think generalists have this kind of wider perspective to the world and to different specific themes and domains that they are not so much afraid about surprises, even bad surprises, which might turn out to be good surprises when you are prepared and you take them seriously. So here we come to the core of serendipity mindset. So how can you create an art of benefiting from unexpected. I think these experts, deep experts, that's difficult maybe for them. That's my, I don't know if it's Scandinavian, Finnish, or global perspective. I have been studying serendipity for more than 10 years, and this is kind of one of the understanding what I have got from there.
I can see Andy chomping at the bit to come in on there. Andy.
Well, the conversation is so personally rich and really important for business leaders to think about, because what you're leading to is how do you make decisions and how do you trust that you've made the right one? Because all too often the teams come together. I had a situation, won't mention which auto company, but they had a very collaborative culture. 30 people would come into a meeting and no decisions were ever made. They had a culture problem. It was so collaborative that it was great. Everybody had a voice, but nobody could make the decisions or trust that the right ones were made. And so there's that. And on the other side, I do a lot of work in healthcare, and the doctors fit into boxes. And so regardless of what symptoms you have must have rheumatoid arthritis, or you must have carpal tunnel, or you must have some box, because they can't see in a very serendipitous way what's actually your problem, because they only know the boxes and how to deal with it. So there are all kinds of implications here for how do you run a thriving business in fast changing times, not the least of which is all your certainties are uncertain. So cool conversation.
That's actually a very valid point about healthcare. I work with some professionals in the lean healthcare business, and I hear that particular statement all the time. Martin, I wanted to give you an opportunity to add something extra to this point if you want. We've probably got about 12 minutes left, so I want to move on to a final point. But Martin, I know you probably have some extra commentary on this.
Just very quick as I can. There's a number of questions around what constitutes a team. We're living in a very divisive society, or it has been, and teams are divided. You have a job title, you have a role, you have a function, you have a purpose, you have an expertise. Perhaps it's time for us to recognise the whole. I'm a beekeeper. That has massively informed what it is that I do. I was speaking with I'll be quick. I was speaking with a friend, and he was telling me about a board meeting he had about 4 months ago, and it was on Zoom. And for the first time ever, he saw his colleagues more in the round. He saw them in their own homes. The relationship shifted, and then something happened in the board meeting, and it was wonderful, and it shifted the dynamic again. The HR director, they were talking. The HR director looked over to one side, and she just said, "Will you stop doing that? You can't put sellotape around your brother's head. Now stop it." And then she came back to the meeting, and the dynamic had changed. The whole person, it wasn't the HR director sat on a bum in a boardroom. It was the whole person and where she was. Changed dynamic. And Simon said it was the most effective, swift meeting board meeting that they've ever had.
You're talking very much about humanizing the whole process there, and I'm fortunate. I'm working with a bank at the moment on a transformational journey, and human resources, their people are leading that transformational journey, or at least becoming leaders within that transformational journey. And this is really all about people. That is a focus of my work at the moment, this sort of key differentiator, this missing element in all the process focused methods and frameworks. They ignore the people, they give them a cursory nod, but they tend not to talk about them, which is a bit of a segue. Excuse me, shouldn't be coughing on mic, but some of the things you've been talking about, of course, we're sort of pulling ourselves out of chaos. We did this sort of not just a shallow dive, this deep dive into chaos in the last few weeks and months. And this should be a good topic to bring us to the end of this panel in the next 10 minutes is we always seem to be at our best, whether we're performing as individuals, especially as teams, within chaos, within calamity. When everything's sort of overwhelming and calamitous, we're all sort of suddenly able to do things we were never able to do before. So how can we remain in a state of crisis without being in a crisis? How can we continue to leverage the greatness that comes through when we're faced with calamity by continuing to thrive without being calamitous? Who wants to grab that? Ellen, let you start with. Oh, Martin wants to jump in. All right, Martin, run with that.
Well,
So
I want to reframe your question a little bit, Nigel. How can we stay in a state of motivation
Like that.
without calamity? Because crisis can be very focusing and very motivating. If I don't do something about this now, things are going to fall apart. So we want to stay in that state of motivation without the adrenal load and the exhaustion that comes from crisis. And if I may, I'd also like to address a couple of things. Again, things that came through the chat, things that we've talked about a little bit about the way people are meeting today. Is that less human or less interactive than the opportunities we had to run into each other in the hallways, etc.? Unfortunately, I think some of the worst characteristics of meetings can be carried forward into the current circumstances. But to Martin's story, there's also, we see people so much more as human beings now. We see their environment. We hear their children. We hear their dogs. I mean, whatever it is. And we also, if we understand the opportunities in this format of communications, we need to bring more fun and humanity into our meetings. Fun increases creativity by 300%. And really making sure that we're not all just sitting here staid and listening and afraid to move in front of the camera, but that we can interact as human beings. And I bring music into some of my meetings. I bring, icebreakers, even with teams that have been working together for a long time. An icebreaker, a fun something to start a meeting off can be really beneficial at building those bonds and strengthening those bonds.
Ellen, I love the rephrasing. So, Martin, how can we stay in a state of motivation and get that 300% gain from happy, motivated people?
Recognize ourselves and recognize other. Acknowledge ourselves and acknowledge other. Be aware. I had an experience some years ago. I was driving back from the meeting. I don't get angry, but I was getting angry, and suddenly I was outside. My experience was of the observer and not the participant. And something really strange happened. I saw the anger pass, and I wasn't experiencing it. The way we experience things is I think it's bound into language. In Gaelic Irish, they have a situation. They have happiness on them. They wear sadness. It's something they can divest themselves of. We are sad. We are angry. It becomes a descriptor. It becomes a definition of the organism. To recognize that, to be able to become the observer rather than participant, I think, for me, it's been incredibly valuable.
Who would like, Andy or Ilka? I'd love to hear your perspective. Ilka, yes, please, and then we'll probably finish up with Andy before we have final thoughts. Ilka.
I think that's an interesting question, how to keep your motivation or even improve your motivation in sense of, crisis and that kind of thing. And of course, this sense of urgency, that has been always, the big driving force for situations like that. But I would like to highlight also especially in this new ecosystem environment and community building environment, this kind of sense of belonging. Where do you belong to? If you belong to a certain community, if you belong to a certain ecosystem, you will get a lot of power and empowerment and also inspiration from other people who are actually in the similar situation. But if you feel strongly that you belong to some sort of community which gives you power, and I'm not talking only within enterprises, but also in this kind of extended enterprise environments, which we are entering as well. So that the borders between the freelancers and the enterprises are mingling, so that enterprises start to use more and more freelancers. So this kind of sense of belonging to the ecosystem or community, I think they are very important in the future.
Yeah, that goes back to the earlier comments of herd, belonging, sameness, some of those things that were being mentioned earlier. Andy, Terry Nichols had an interesting comment about always requiring leadership. Well, I work very much in the world of collective leadership and within the team science sort of sphere. And really the individual members of a team become leaders. They take on leadership characteristics by demonstrating characteristics, etc. The team then start to provide collective leadership towards the organization. That's part of distributed leadership. Going to throw that in with any other comments you might have on what we've just spoken about. And
I'm teaching followership for one client, to your point, because the emphasis leadership. If you Google leadership, there are 405 million responses. If you Google followership, there are 1 million. Tells you where we're focused, and it's a huge business. But a leader can't get anything done effectively without good followers, and we're not spending the time investing on those folks. Now, to your point, I'm a big believer in collaborative teams that can come up with good decisions, test them, and I'm a big tester because we never know if it's right or not, and trust each other for the moment. And they can rotate who the leader is. There are all kinds of ways of creating different kinds of collaborations, not always command and control. And I do think that, I'll say this a little quietly, the women leaders who I'm studying lead very collaboratively. They have good decisiveness, but they also have a good team that they pull together of the experts, subject matter experts. They listened, and all of the discussion, we just had an article published about this pandemic. Did the women do better than men for a reason? Well, they did it differently. And consequently, there's a whole lot of discussion about how men lead and women lead. But I do think we're on the brink of some very interesting possibilities about how to change how we get things done, assuming that's the point of a leader and followers. And I do think it could be quite exciting. My last thought, though, is not to be an anti-fragile, but habits are important for humans. And great athletes are very habit-driven. And I don't care if you're a golfer or you're doing the Tour de France or you're Drew Brees throwing the football. The habits take over. You don't have to think. And all of a sudden you are excelling. So let's make sure we keep habits and what those come and mean into this time when there are no habits that we can count on. And I do think that part of that post-normal is going to be finding the right set of new habits. My last thought.
So in the last sort of 90 seconds or 2 minutes of this, I'll add my final thought. Followers create leaders.
Yeah.
And there's actually, and there's a phrase that often says you get the leaders you deserve, but we'll just leave it as followers create leaders. Ellen, what final 20 seconds of thoughts might you have for the listeners?
You can lead from any chair. It's not just a title. And process versus people. If people are part of creating the process, if they have frameworks within which they can create effective process, then there's no contradiction between the two.
Wonderful thoughts. Martin, what would you like to add for the people who are listening for your final thoughts?
One word. Entelechy. Entelechy. So it's the realization of potential. I'm reading the description. The supposed vital principle that guides the development of and functioning of an organism or other system or organization. The soul.
Ilka, you have the last word of this panel. What would you like? I know you said vocability earlier. What would be your last thought as we say bye-bye to everybody? Ilka.
I think the good thing for everyone in these times would be to start to like surprises. So kind of learn to like surprises because you will have them a lot.
Panel, look, you are all awesome. We could have talked for 2 hours or more. Thank you to Sai, to Todd behind the scenes, to the organizers of Catalyzing the Future. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I hope it was valuable for those listening. Thank you,
Nigel,
everybody.
you are terrific. Nigel, bravo,
Thanks,
Nigel.
Nigel. Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Awesome job.
Shall we improvise what we're saying?
Sounds like a good plan. Kia ora, whānau.
So welcome everybody. This is the panel on Together into the Future, Business, Humanity, and Society. And unfortunately, I think I had my microphone muted before, so you guys probably weren't able to hear me. And I'm talking away merrily. My name's Todd Nilson. I'm the moderator on the panel. I run an organization called Clock Tower Advisors, which is a digital strategy consultancy, and I work a lot with building online communities using technologies. Really excited to have the group on today. We've had a couple of substitutions, people who've agreed last minute who were on other panels. Sharon Dugan, forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Let me know if I got that right. As well as Charlie Weinberg, and of course our planned guests, Matthew Jackson and Brian Rich. I'm wondering if you guys could all take a moment and introduce yourselves in a minute or two, and maybe any reflections you've had on the event so far. It would be really interesting to hear what observations you're bringing into the day from the ecosystem of conversations so far. Over to you, Matthew. Why don't we do you first?
Thanks, Todd. Kia ora whānau. Dialing in from Austin, Texas, but originally from New Zealand. My grandfather's from Kenya. My father was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, so I am a global citizen. I specialize in disruption. I am anti-fragile. I like to break things on purpose. And my commitment here is just to provide a safe space, allow us to have conversation about how do we take the pathway forward. There are some sessions I've been in that are talking about the status quo. They are using the current narrative. Those domains frustrate me. I feel like I live in the future already, so I'd love to welcome you here.
Awesome. Welcome, Matthew. Yeah, I'm reminded of what's the statement? The future is already with us. It's just not evenly distributed, right? Very good. Sharon, you want to introduce yourself to the panel?
Thanks, Todd. I'm Charlie Weinberg. I am a total usurper here. I kind of am here by accident, but I mean, that's okay. I know nothing about business. I work in the charity sector, have done all my life. I run a very small organisation that works nationally, designing and delivering therapeutic group work programmes, often with people in significant crisis and often in secure settings, detention settings. And I suppose I come into this a bit, partly I came to the panel because the previous panel left me with loads of kind of half-formed thoughts and unanswered questions, and Kieran got me thinking about loads of really challenging stuff. And it's partly about, you know, how long does change take? And on the one hand, you know, we need to slow down and take our time and breathe. And on the other hand, we've got a Black Lives Matter movement saying it's been 400 years, nothing's getting better. How much longer do you want me to stand back and bloody well breathe because nothing's happening? Something about the reality for people who are living their worst case scenario, you know, people in detention centres having their uterus removed by a doctor against their will, people in prison serving indefinite sentences with absolutely no contact with family or friends who are being locked up for 23.5 hours. You know, thinking about this situation through those lenses, I think adds a perspective around, well, breathing and sitting with discomfort and kind of thinking through my life goals is a different set of circumstances, I guess, or requests to make of people. And finally, I suppose something about the individual and the system, and something that's happened for me today is thinking about organisms rather than organizations. And, you know, organizations, people and systems are living, evolving beings. That's something that I think is common to us, whatever part of the system we're in. So I'm in my kitchen. Apologies. It's a small flat.
Oh, wonderful! It's so good to get those opening perspectives and what brings you to the table here as well. Kieran, would you like to take a moment and introduce yourself?
Yeah, great. So my name is Kieran Duggan. I'm coming here today from rural County Kildare in Ireland. I would describe myself as a reformed or maybe reforming serial entrepreneur. I've experience in both business and in the not-for-profit or voluntary sector in building projects. Some successful, others not so. Matthew, I'm sort of the opposite to you in a way. I live in the house that was built by my great grandparents, and I farmed the land that my family have farmed for at least 300 years. It gets a bit sketchy when we go back that far. So my perspective might be a little bit different. I'm here because I passionately believe that we've needed, our generation or generations have needed something to make us uncomfortable and get us going. And I think this might be the start of it, this crisis we're in. That's me.
It's a wonderful perspective, and I think we clearly are in what I think of as a liminal space where all bets of the past are off, and we have an opportunity to do some reinventing and maybe improving things, which is really the theme of this particular panel. Together into the future. Brian, why don't you round us out by offering us a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. Well, Todd, you've set me up perfectly. Between Matthew and Charlie, I'm Karen. So I'm the principal of Rich Haven Architecture and Preservation, a historic preservation firm in Seattle, and somewhere stretched between New Zealand and I realize, Matthew, you're in Austin, but and London and wherever. But I really appreciate Karen's point of view about being on a farm and a homestead that has been in your family for over 300 years, and appreciate the need to disrupt and evolve and modify what we've got to accommodate the needs of today. And that is really the basis of the principles of future proofing, which I developed when I was doing my master's thesis work a few years ago. And it is the basis of the philosophy of my firm, and I apply it to my projects all the time. In the earlier conversation, there was a lot of discussion about teams and people and having a base. I want to say one person mentioned there that the past is an anchor. I view the past more as more than an anchor. Yes, it's important psychologically and socially as a base for us, but I also view it as the starter blocks that a runner's using in a sprint. It's the thing that you push off from and you start from that gives you a great start and launches you into that future.
Thanks, Brian. So thematically, some of the areas that we're looking to touch upon in this panel are thinking about business, humanity, and society, which are really kind of three of the four pillars that we were looking at when trying to put this event together. I'd love to get a reflection from each of you about this consideration that as we are trying to think differently and respond in what seems to be an increasingly VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. How are we to maybe change our thinking? So we are at the spot, I think in the last session, Andy Simon talked about getting outside of ourselves, and this is an opportunity to create new habits together. What are the habits that we should be cultivating and creating as we move forward in a world that seems to have, I'm reminded of the phrase, the hits keep on coming. We've had an awful lot of disruption that's been hitting us on a regular basis. How are we to live in this world? How are we to build sustainable, thriving businesses that consider our humanity and consider how we're affecting society? I don't know, would one of you care to take that on first?
I don't mind stepping in. When we think immediately, or when I think immediately about a humane business, a business that is profitable economically, environmentally, and socially, I think of small local business. I think of what business grew from 200 years ago, or 150 years ago, or 50 years ago. Small local. Now, that's probably like the globalization that we've all experienced and have profited from quite considerably seems to go against that initial thought that I have. Is there reining in somewhere? I don't know. That's just my thought.
I don't agree that we've profited from globalization. I think we have more debt than ever before. And no, I'm not just talking about financial debt. We have a debt in the community of mental health. So I'm not disagreeing with your point. I'm just saying I don't agree that we've profited from globalization.
If I could just come back, when I say profited, I do think we've profited in that we largely in the West, largely in the world, polio is not a problem anymore. The vastly more billions of people are being fed now than ever were before.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There are sort of very basic kind of things that have improved. We all have clothes and shoes and stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Can I follow on? And again, we could all sit here and contradict each other all night, probably. And I think it's helpful because you've just made me think here. And we've also, in the UK, got more people using food banks than we've had for hundreds of years. So I think what this bit of the conversation is making me think about is, again, returning to the importance of putting things in a historical context. Where are we in the system? What are the conditions that have enabled and allowed either polio to be cured or hunger and poverty to be so rampant in the world's richest countries? They are not single events that have happened in isolation. They are the result of a huge historical series of systems and structures that we continue to perpetuate. And if we fail to recognise them as such, we miss a lot of tricks and very important anchors, because history doesn't stop. It's not static. We're in it all the time. And that makes me think about, in terms of, what Kieran's talking about, undoing large-scale industrial manufacture. Small is beautiful. Organising ourselves in groups that are manageable, where people know each other and where profit isn't about capital being accumulated and stored by individuals. It's about benefit to communities who can touch it and feel it and live it, and who make investments that they reap. Is there a way for business to be humane? Absolutely. I think Karl Marx would have said yes. Have we got it? No. Is what we're doing about improving and investing in humanity? Absolutely not. It's about capital. Is there a possibility to have a humane prison? I would say absolutely not. It's anathema. It's antithesis. The same with a humane police force. If we place these ideas in a historical context, we can begin to understand that they had a necessary function. If we continue to dream them into our reality, we're not reconfiguring anything. We're reforming things that are no longer doing us any good.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the recognition that there are both good and bad aspects of our past and what we've done, what we've created. And there's both good and bad aspects of our global community. And as I apply my philosophy of future proofing to things, I refer to it as the starter blocks or the base. But I'll tell you what, those starter blocks got to change over time. And you got to recognize what doesn't work about them, and be willing to change and adapt that to something new and different.
I really do relate to all of this discussion on a very personal level. I live in a small town in northeastern Wisconsin, a rural kind of community that had formerly had some large, even global reach companies that had started really around the turn of the last century, and just had not thought about sustainability, not thought about their leadership and maintaining themselves over time. And we're now at a position where at least the approach that we've been taking more locally here, and some of the things that I've tried to be involved with, is to encourage thinking about entrepreneurship and starting new businesses and doing them in a way that are more thoughtful about the environment in which we live and the world, situations in which we find ourselves now. How do we build those more sustainable businesses going forward that are thoughtful and society embracing in that approach? So I really do appreciate those ideas. I think one of the things that I struggle with, though, is how do we challenge entrepreneurs or business leaders in particular to change or complicate or improve their way of thinking. I know, Matthew, your stock in trade is business disruption. How do you go about counseling people to think about changing or building things going forward? And how do we, at the same time, because this is affecting me in the city in which I live, this small town is very concerned about holding on to what made it meaningful as a place to live. Like, how do I balance these two things? Maintaining what's good and carrying forward with something new, or changing my mindset going forward.
Is that a question specifically directed
Not
at me?
necessarily. I just thought of you first as we were going there.
Okay. There's two things that come to mind for me out of this discussion. One is there's a community that I spend time in called the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, where we are using Indigenous models. So the Māori people of New Zealand look at 500-year strategies, and we have given personhood to rivers and to the maunga in New Zealand, and they see the health of the river and the health of the mountain directly related to the health of people. And I can imagine, Karen, with you living on the land, you feel healthy when the land is healthy. I've been writing recently about the future of money, and I believe that money can be smart and can be linked to a social impact outcome, and can be linked to an IoT device, and we can build new models for finance where we can actually link remuneration models to sustainable development goals. Like, on the other side of that, I also struggle to change organizations. I don't have the answer for what we need to do with organizations. I sit between, we need to burn them down, and I even sit on this conference and look at it and go, we don't have anywhere near enough diversity. We're not balanced. We're not gender balanced. We're not ethnically balanced. This is a very, I'm confronted by even sitting in this space at the moment to know that we don't have accurate representation in this conversation. And for me, even to get to the point now where I proactively recognize my racism, acknowledge that that I am a racist because of the social constraint that I exist inside of, the privilege that I have, that only with that recognition can I start to then change the environment that I'm in. And you go through a journey, and if I think back, my past journey was to really recognize the gender bias that I hold, and that I have never been discriminated against on the basis of the fact that I am such a privileged white male born in New Zealand. I could not have been given a better lottery ticket, So it only comes with speaking and recognizing the bias that we hold, that we can start to recognize the environments we're in and change those structures.
And it's making me think about, as the only woman on the panel now, I'm going to take this massive opportunity to jump in. Thanks, Matthew. I think it's making me think about, I started my introduction saying I know nothing about business, except for the fact that I live in a capitalist free market economy, and I've grown up in such. So I know that much about business. I know people want my money, and I want to earn money in order to live and purchase commodities. But if thinking about some of what Matthew's saying, I'd consider myself an active anti-racist, and an active anti-oppressive practitioner. And I would consider myself on that journey over a long period of time and absolutely committed to it. And yes, I think it's important to recognise our own position in that oppressive structure and process, but I'd rather be challenging it and fighting it than constantly reminding myself and everybody else that I can't do anything about it. I'm not suggesting that's what you're doing, Matthew, and two, I guess part of that wider conception then is, so why don't I go into the local coffee shop that's going bust and say, listen, you're going bust anyway, invite people in to help you reconfigure what this is. But all the time business is focused on making a profit and accumulating wealth. Of course it can't do that. It's a resource. It's got to pay its rent. It's got to pay its staff. It's got to find a way to make a bottom line look healthy. And those two ideas can't, how do they live together? How do community assets or community resources become genuinely owned and run and developed by the people that use them if they're constantly under threat because of a lack of capital?
I'd like to pop in here because what I'm hearing from both Matthew and Charlie is discussion about ways to change in a certain context. And I'd like to offer a different context that actually has some of the same mechanisms in it. In my research, I found the process of what's called panarchy and adaptive cycles. These were developed by C.S. Halling and Lance Gunderson in the 70s and 80s, and were developed in specific reference to ecological environments. And the adaptive cycle, imagine the Mobius strip or the infinity symbols. You come over one side of that cycle, you have a breakdown and a reorganization of the parts there that are of value. So you kind of reconsolidate your base each time, and you're evaluating what's valuable, what's not. In my context of historic buildings, I'm looking at it from what gives that historic building character? What's important about it historically? Is it the aesthetic? Is it the structure? Is it something like that? And then we build off of that, and we figure out how we can adapt or change that building, as I suggested earlier, to meet the newer needs. What are the needs of today, and what do we anticipate in the future? And I can see Ciaran, you want to pop in there too, don't you? I'll stop.
Yeah, because I was you've put I have to tell this story now because it's come out from two angles. So Matthew, some of what you were talking about really resonated with me, and Todd, the way that so I live in a house that my great grandparents began to build in 1836, and my wife would strongly argue it's never been finished, but so there's an awful lot of it that's really valuable, but we're facing into the winter now, and our reality is that we have to make too much heat altogether, and you get one chance of grabbing a bit of heat as it goes past you, and once it's gone past you, it's gone. So that's the character. I can tell you, Brian, that the character of the old building, that's part of it. It's cold, and it makes you value the warmth. But there's something. So we need to let go. And should I knock the damn thing down and build a new one that will hold the heat in, that won't destroy the atmosphere, that will let in more light, or do I adapt it and try and make the best of it, or whatever, or keep the old? This is actually what we need to do. Is we need to think about this in the context of all our institutions and all our thinking, our business institutions, our governmental institutions, all our healthcare, our legal system. It all needs to be thought about now. This is the time to do it.
I really love the insights you guys have brought, and I like even sort of the thinking about the building and extending that metaphor, to how we think about moving forward in society and what's here. And we're we're living in, if you will, a historic building from the pre-COVID times, and it's not serving our needs, and from the pre-social justice times, which we're still living in. How do we adapt the use of what's still good about the foundation, or are we talking about tearing down the building entirely and building something completely new? Is one of the things that kind of strikes me from what you guys have been saying so far.
Can I jump in again,
Please.
Todd? Sorry, I'm talking a lot. But what Kieran described, and I think the conversation that Matthew and Brian have set up, for me, it made me think really clearly about this idea in criminal justice, the tension between the abolitionists and the reformists. Do you burn it all down, get rid of it all, it's all rubbish and it's got to go and it's not broken, it's functioning how it's supposed to and we need to redesign everything tomorrow? I'm obviously exaggerating for comic effect and speed, versus reformists who kind of, well, if you have a therapeutic prison, it's better. And if you have better food in prison, people will at least be able to eat well. We can tinker around at the edges and make a terrible system more bearable. And they're constantly in kind of tension with each other. And when Kieran was describing the house, it became really obvious to me. A comment from another, I don't know which session it was during today. I think one of the panelists, I think it was Elena, was really clear about the need for leaders to bring vision. And what vision does is enable people to see a destination or an end result or the new house. Whether the new house is a total rebuild or whether the new house is a kind of incremental set of redesigns and adaptations that happen over a period of time, the leader provides the vision and helps create the timescale for the incremental reforms that need to happen so that at the end of a process, the house is warm, whether it's old or new or different or, you can clearly understand where you're going and how you're going to get there and who needs to do what. And I think that's just really crystallized some of this for me. At the moment, I don't feel that it's certainly in the UK and probably not around the world, there's any clarity around either what the vision is, where are we going to end up, or how we're going to get there, or who needs to do what.
One of the go ahead, Kieran.
Just very, very quickly, this comes back to something we talked about in the last group, Charlie, around sitting in the question. Let's not necessarily look for the answer. Sit in the question and give it time.
So I wanted to add that one of the challenges I see, at least in the U.S., and I do appreciate the global reach of this particular group, but in the U.S. right now, we often see a lot of really extreme positions. And so finding that point that Charlie described about a process of incremental improvement, that everybody sees the vision, sees the steps in that process, and gets to a point where you get buy-in from all sides of that, can be very, very difficult. And that's a question that I don't know how to breach. Todd's mentioned that we lack a diversity of personhood in this group. I agree with that. But we have so many different conflicting needs to bridge that having that masterful vision is very difficult, and often it seems to me it has to come externally. When does a community or a society unite? It's when there's an external threat, even climate change as an existential issue has not united the people of the world around it yet.
Yes, absolutely. Matthew, you want to chime in?
Yes, and I watched the debate last night, and so Brian, I feel very compassionate towards you and the situation you're in. I was confronted. I've literally got no other words for that. What I wanted to add was First of all, to build on Charlie's discussion, I'm very good at creating futures, but I'm also really crap at explaining the narrative to get the people on board. And then I'm always wrong on my timelines. So don't always recognize that the future that I would be creating is accurate. And just to add to what Brian was talking about, I always believe that I have to look back to make an accurate assessment of the resources that I have available to me before I create a new future. And then just to add on to Brian's conversation, for the past, since 2013, I've been studying transactionalism, and on the basis that this came out of some work in the 1970s from a philosopher called Alfred Dewey, and the core principle of transactionalism. And it's not about transactions as we consider them in the current. It's not a narrative about exchange of dollars, right? Transactionalism is about how do we work together, and how do we exchange reciprocal value with each other. And what we study is to understand our own bias and the orientation that we bring into an environment, and then to listen for the bias or the behavior that's coming from others inside of that environment. And I gave a talk recently and the talk was entitled that, diversity doesn't come from your race or your gender, it actually comes from your bias. So for me, it's really, if we're creating new models, what we need to be looking at is do we understand ourselves and how we work well with others? And then how do we start to articulate our own personal aims? How do we understand the aims of the others that we're working with, and where are the mutual crossover in those aims so that we can start to point in a new direction?
Sorry, Todd, can I just, because the word transaction hasn't been used a lot today, I'm really sorry, it won't be long, but just Matthew talking about transactionalism, I know it's not a direct link, but one of the models that we use a lot in our therapeutic group work and that we expose for participants is transactional analysis. So the idea that people can communicate most clearly and most freely and openly when they understand what is happening with their ego state. So it's just interesting to me that you're talking about transactionalism being a kind of set of circumstances and a set of conditions, and we're talking about transactional communication styles and understanding what's being transacted between human beings emotionally. I think there's something in that, and if capital or capitalism begins from the notion of a transaction takes place that can be profitable and exploitable, then maybe there's something in this notion of what is a transaction and why are we so fixated by it.
For me, that really resonates as a practical application that we can take. I work in community building, whether it's online or in person, and the beginnings of creating that sense of community is by a transaction, an exchange of trust. Exchange begins with small tokens, with reciprocation with one another, and by sharing values and perspectives and biases, if you will, to pick up on what Matthew said. I think that's a fascinating concept, the whole idea of transactionism. I definitely want to learn more about that myself. I see, sadly, we're just scratching the beginnings of this conversation, but we're coming up on the end of the conversation already. I'm wondering if I could charge each of you, maybe if you could leave us with a final thought or reflection on the day so far and from the conversation here, and maybe even put it in the terms of, if you're giving people just one practical thing they could do or think about or read or take away, what would that be for you? And whoever's ready goes first.
One thing that has it's a theme that's come through. I championed it in the last discussion, and I think what I would say is trust one another.
Love that. I love that. Matthew, I think you were coming in second there.
I'm doing some writing at the moment, and the title of the writing is "Follow the Guy in the High Vis Vest." I attended a traffic accident the other day and took over the scene for 2 hours. Some of us are very good at operating inside of chaos. It calms us. So if you're inside of a situation, gain situational awareness, find the person wearing the high vis vest. That's just to speak to the current environment. The thing that I practice the most, the thing that I spend as much time on as possible, is to act in a vulnerable state and to let other people know what help I need. So my request to the community is just to let yourself be vulnerable and to practice asking for help.
Wonderful, wonderful. We have 2 minutes left here. A minute for each of you, Brian and Charlie.
Okay, I'm going to take my minute. It doesn't make any sense and it's not a fully formed thought, but it's something about asking who's profiting from this situation, who's being exploited in this situation, who's getting any value out of this situation, and how do I feel about it, and what do I think? Therefore, what do I do?
I'm going to borrow something that Matthew actually wrote and share it on one of his websites, which is you can't navigate chaos, so embrace it. And the thought for me there is that each of us as people, as communities, as societies, at all different levels, we have a core value system, which is our base. From there, of course, many of us go in different directions with different aspects of it, but to recognize and acknowledge that core value system, I think, is incredibly valuable as the starting block, as the base to build from as we progress through all the chaos and stuff that we have to not navigate, but just work through. Thank you, Matthew.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there for everybody. Thank you, my new friends, for honoring us with your ideas and your enthusiasm. We appreciate you coming. We're going to take a quick break here and be back in 5 minutes with the closing conversations for Catalyzing the Future. See you guys.
Hi, Sai.
How are you?
I'm well. Are we live? Is this?
We are live, my good friend. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you as well.
Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. Truly appreciate it.
Not at all. It's my pleasure. Shall we? I think we're waiting for Whit, or
yeah, we are waiting for Whit. I don't know if he's here. If he's not here, we've got you, which is what more can we ask for? Let me put it that way. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. We can start anytime.
Excellent. So, Maha, I would love for you to introduce yourself to the world if they haven't heard your name, and then we can dive into definitively your thinking and your next book, which we're all eagerly waiting for. So please.
Yes, thank you so much, Sai. So my name is Maha Hossein Aziz. I'm a professor at NYU, focusing on global risk. Basically, that means we research threats to our stability within countries, but also across the world. As you can imagine, the last few years, risk has been heightened because of various leaders and various issues that have come up. And that led to my first book, Future World Order, where I talked about our global legitimacy crisis, which I'm happy to share today. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought it would be worthwhile to reflect on the effect of the pandemic on our stability. So happy to share ideas from that as well.
That's a brilliant segue, Maha. Please, I mean, what is the impact on our stability from COVID and what we're seeing out there and what you're looking at? Please share.
Sure. So first, it's important to remember that pre-COVID-19, I know it seems like a long time ago, but pre-COVID-19 and in the 2010s, in that decade, we were already at a crossroads. We were already dealing with major challenges to our stability, geopolitically, politically, economically, and socially. And what I explore in my work is the idea that these risks that existed pre-COVID-19, frankly, have only deepened and will only continue to deepen in the 2020s. So first, of course, as we all know, geopolitically, we are aware that the world has experienced a shift, or at the very least, there's a lack of consensus about the structure of our very international system. Is it still led by the US? Is it still led by multipolar powers? We really don't have clarity, and I'm not convinced that a change in leadership if there is a change in leadership come November, I'm not convinced that we'll necessarily have clarity again about who's in charge. And what I also think it's worth recognizing is that in the last decade, we've seen the emergence of non-state actors that have at times shaped geopolitics or influenced geopolitics in distinct ways, whether it's the citizen protester protesting about climate change, or the activist billionaire offering their perspective on global policy, or even tech firms. And I think what we'll need to really reflect on in the coming decade is to what extent the nature of power is changing. Is it still appropriate to talk about a state-centric understanding of power? Do we need to accept these other types of influencers? So there's a lack of clarity that will continue. And I'll get into the pandemic effect in a second. Secondly, we know that democracy in the 2010s has been under threat, so much so that we have perhaps experienced and are still experiencing a global spring, where we've seen citizens in all political systems, democracy and non-democracies, have challenged their leaders in unprecedented ways, armed with tech. And it's leading to this larger debate or concern about whether democracy is still the best system, which is what we assumed was the case in the post-Cold War era. But again, we don't have global leadership to dictate what the best political system is anymore. So where are we headed politically? Again, a lot of confusion, and we will be dealing with this big question: do we need a new social contract in this decade? as we deal with this crisis of governance, and as we see the rise of non-state actors that often have tried to shape policy domestically, the tech billionaire, the tech firm, the citizen protester. Thirdly, economically, we already have seen that globalization has a threat or an opponent in terms of economic nationalism, populism. But I think we're also going to be headed into this larger crisis, which has already begun, frankly, about who we are in relation to our work. We're headed for a massive occupational identity crisis because of automation taking away jobs. And I think we need to really explore and reflect on how are we going to deal with this new class of people that is losing their jobs or will lose their jobs to automation. Do we need a new economic social contract or a new moral economy? I think this sort of debate will be discussed quite a lot in the coming years. Again, a lot of this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 effect, which I'll explore. My last point before I talk about COVID-19 is the social aspect, the social risk or identity crisis that I think we've been dealing with as a global community, but also within countries. Are we globalists? Are we nationalists? Care about the other. I think it's safe to say in the last decade, we've seen a rise in xenophobia. We've seen an evolution in terms of extremism. It's evolved from Islamist extremism to far right, to Buddhist, to Hindu extremism, and so forth. Do we have shared global values? I think there's going to be an urgent need to have these discussions in the coming decade, regardless of who wins the U.S. election. I think we will have to discuss these issues. Any questions about that before I go to COVID-19?
Maha, I'll put it this way: your brilliance emanates in terms of exemplifying the complexity that's before us. I mean, quite honestly, because there's so many facets. If I can ask one particular question, what is the one thread that you see connecting all those aspects that you just called out, Maha?
That's a great question. I wish there was one thread, and if I had to define or tie it together, I guess it relates back to this idea that there is no global leadership. There is not a global community of leaders that is setting the tone anymore. And I guess it goes back to the lack of clarity on who's in charge of the world order. If the US for the moment or for the last few years has taken a different position, what does that mean for our larger global agenda? Does that mean that other organizations like the UN, for instance, are going to take a bigger role in setting that global tone? Does the UN have the legitimacy? Do any of our existing leaders or institutions have the legitimacy to really set that global tone and deal with these issues that are all, frankly, interrelated? I think, I don't know if they have the legitimacy. And I think that's why it's encouraging to see other types of actors, like I said, the citizen protester, even the tech billionaire, at times filling that gap that is being left by our policymakers. So I think, so that's my quick response to that question.
So Maha, what leadership is needed? Can you give it form? Can you give it description? Can you? I'm trying to capitalize on the brilliance that you have, my friend. So I definitely want to kind of dig deeply.
No, thank you. What kind of leadership do we need? I mean, in theory, we should have that leadership emanating from our political leaders who are elected, but I just don't see that happening in the near term. And I think what we're going to continue to see is that the leadership is coming from these other types of communities, from non-state actors. And I don't think we can stop that. And to what extent we're going to then need to, as I said, redefine the social contract to take into account these other influencers. I think that's where we will need to put our energy. But it's a tough question. I really challenge our listeners to think about which world leader is really governing in a way that that is working for their citizens? Is it only Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand who's figured it out? That's how it feels like these days. So I think it'll be interesting to see how other types of actors try to continue to fill that gap, and what will that mean for the nature of power this decade in terms of our geopolitics and our politics domestically.
I want to ask one more question, if you will, because I love the emphasis on citizenship and the social contract. And are we truly at a point now where citizenship, broadly defined on a world stage, is redefining that social contract?
I think to a certain extent it is. To what extent, though, it has been accepted by governments, I think that's a separate issue. So I feel there will need to be a clear discussion between citizen representatives and government about what the expectations are as we navigate the 2020s. And of course, now we're navigating a COVID-19 world as well, the effect of which will sadly likely continue for a few years at the very least. So that would be that's what I think at this stage. But since I've mentioned COVID-19, maybe I can...
Yes, please do, please.
So what I guess the basic point that I want our listeners to be aware of is that a lot of the risks we are dealing with now, they existed before the pandemic, but the pandemic has just exacerbated it. We've seen it already and we'll continue to see it. Geopolitically, I think it's safe to say the global response to the virus has shown we don't have leadership. And it's not just about US leadership taking a different approach. I think we see that it's across the board. There's a lack of consensus about the vaccine, about what the best strategy is, and so forth. And I think what we've also noted is that there's been this emergent COVID-19 bilateralism in the last few months, where you have countries stepping up and offering support to other countries in terms of COVID-19 diplomacy, masks, doctors, etc. How will that reshape our diplomacy, but also how will that reshape our geopolitics in the coming months and years? Is that going to create new alliances that are completely separate from our discussions about a US versus China or a multipolar world? I think that will be interesting to observe. But again, the lack of understanding at this stage about how these relationships could evolve is a threat to our stability. It deepens our crisis of geopolitical legitimacy. We don't really know who's in charge. Related to that, of course, everyone is aware at this stage about the vaccine nationalism that is brewing. Some countries are already offering it strategically to others. Other countries have said they don't want to share the vaccine when it comes out. So I think, again, the pandemic has reminded us that we don't have global leadership, and perhaps we don't really have faith in our current group of political leaders across the board. Maybe we need to reimagine the G7 or a sort of a G7-like advisory body, which has leaders who are beating the virus, who have had success with that's giving us advice or leading the charge against this global campaign against the virus. Because right now the existing institutions, the existing leaders are failing. We just don't have leadership. Related to that, COVID-19 has reminded us that we don't have, there was a brief period when governments could regain the legitimacy of their citizens. They had a chance to show us that they could govern and navigate this unprecedented pandemic. But I think it's safe to say, with all the protests that have happened against government, against certain COVID-19 policies, a lot of governments have fallen short of citizen expectation and their response. And this is just going to get worse as time goes on, as we ease out of the pandemic, hopefully soon. We will question, did our governments do enough in that initial period? And now, are they giving us enough support going forward? Again, I would argue, in this COVID-19 context, do we need a new social contract that reflects the new needs of citizens in a COVID-19 world? And again, I would argue, do we need to reflect on other types of influencers or supporters? We've seen that in some countries, activist millionaires and billionaires have filled that gap left by government when they failed to deal with or come up with policies to tackle COVID-19. And does that mean there needs to be a more defined role for these activists, billionaires and millionaires? I know it's controversial to say that, and I'm often challenged on this point, but it keeps happening. Again, it happened pre-pandemic, and we're seeing it again with these other types of power players. Thirdly, economically, as we know, a lot of countries have had some success with economic relief packages to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. But the truth is, and some finance ministers have expressed this, they have said this publicly, that we won't be able to help everybody indefinitely. Small businesses, the unemployed, people who've lost their jobs and will not regain their employment as we hopefully move out of the pandemic. And I think, again, we will see more protests about economic failures of our governments. We're going to see more people who some economists have termed precariats, people who are losing their occupational identity because of this period of mass unemployment due to the pandemic. And again, it bleeds into a larger mental health crisis. Again, I would say, do we need to reimagine the economic social contract or a moral economy where we're clear on what we can expect from our governments and vice versa in terms of economic basic public goods? Lastly, I want to highlight again, well, everyone is aware that xenophobia exists. There is a lot of extremism in the world pre-pandemic, but the post-pandemic picture largely negative, where you see a resurgence in, sadly, in xenophobia towards East Asians in some parts of the world because of the perceived origin of the virus. We've seen discrimination against certain historically disenfranchised groups in certain countries where COVID-19 has given an opportunity for more hate, for people to take advantage of this situation. Again, I ask, do we have shared global values? Do we care about the other in this extreme period? And I think the only silver lining I've witnessed, and I'm sure you'll agree, is the response to the George Floyd's death. The response that we saw, over 60 countries, there were protests against racism in response to George Floyd and what happened to him, a devastating event. And the fact that this elicited such a response, and it was a response led by citizens, not by our politicians, not by our world leaders, I think that's very positive. To have seen that there is perhaps a sense of shared global value against racism. There is a sense of a shared global community, even if it's not being driven by our governments or by the state. I think that is very positive. I said this in a few speeches over the summer, where in person and virtually, and I must admit that there were some people who challenged me on this and said that, people were just protesting because they were bored. They wanted to get out of lockdown. I don't think we should be so cynical. I think we should appreciate that there is this sense of a global community around a positive sentiment of being against racism. I think this is positive. Can we capture that sentiment and retain it in the coming decade? It would be amazing, and perhaps it will be led by our youth, who are more, as we know, as we've seen in the last decade, they are more engaged, they are more activist. They do want to have their voice heard. So maybe this will be the silver lining, but largely the pandemic has exacerbated the geopolitical, political, and economic risks that we were already dealing with in the 2010s, and that will probably loom over us in the 2020s. And of course, I didn't mention climate change and the climate crisis, but everyone knows the sad situation in places like California and in Brazil in terms of the fires. So, does this all boil down to global leadership? Are we going to suddenly have global leadership if there's a change in leadership here in the US? I'm not convinced that will necessarily be the case. And I'm sure our viewers have seen or heard the speeches that took place about a week ago at the UN, where it's the same sentiment that came from the U.S. leadership about looking after its own interests. You saw China being more vocal about promoting democracy, human rights, but that's problematic as well. So who are we to look to? Right?
Yeah. Maha, you're reading my mind quite honestly. I mean, I want to ask because I know we have about less than 5 minutes in terms of time. So I definitely want to ask one question that I think is really lurking, and you've called it out, but lurking in people's minds.
Sure.
And this is the thing I've always been in awe of you, because you can zoom out and zoom in. So it's pretty brilliant the way you express it, quite honestly. What has legitimacy now? What can we hold on to as a starting place for legitimacy that moves us forward, Maha?
I think that's a great question. I think the point is that we may need to reimagine our institutions, and a lot of these core ideas, they need to be revisited, right? Whether it's the social contract, whether it's this idea that democracy is the best system. So a lot of these ideas came from the post-Cold War era. The US had the legitimacy to lead the global community and talk about these issues and encourage and nudge the rest of the world to pursue these values. And it's not to say that other countries haven't tried to fill that gap. France, Macron, for instance, has definitely taken a bigger role on the global stage and tried to, perhaps gain legitimacy as a global player. But the point is, it may be time to imagine or reimagine some of these core ideas and to think about where power lies or where influence lies. We can't ignore all of the citizen-led movements that have surfaced in the last decade on different issues, and more recently have led to governments changing their policies. So the very nature of governance or policy making is responding to these citizen-led movements, and I think that's positive. And it leads to this larger debate: do we need to reimagine our political systems in the coming decade to take into account not just COVID-19, but of course the new influencers, the new factors, the tech factor, the new influencers in terms of the citizen protester, the tech billionaire, etc. Like I said, maybe it's time to reimagine these ideas that we assumed would just stay indefinitely after the end of Cold War. As Francis Fukuyama said at the end of the Cold War, this is the end of the history. This is it. This is as much as our political system will evolve. Democracy is the best system. Even he has said he has concerns. It's time to reimagine the world in which we live, and to have these sorts of discussions. Obviously, conferences are important, but within our communities, we should be thinking about what it is that we expect of our political systems. And is democracy still it? Are our existing institutions and leaders, are they what we want? I'm not calling for a revolution, but I think there's a space to hear more voices and to affect change in a way that we wouldn't have taken as seriously perhaps in the past.
Yeah. Maha, you're brilliant. I completely agree with what you just said in terms of you're not calling for revolution, but you are truly calling for awakening, enlightenment, engagement, and finding our next, respectfully, best self as we move forward. And from one citizen of the world, if you will, and myself, I'm glad your voice is out there tremendously. So thank you very, very deeply, Maha.
No, and thank you for organizing these conferences. This is important. And I'm sure this will lead, the event itself will lead to, it'll spark conversations in other parts of the world amongst the people who are watching. And I think that's part of the solution for us longer term. So thank you, Sai.
Thank you, Maha. And the only thing I say is this wouldn't be possible without your presence. So deeply, deeply appreciate your time and very much grateful for it. So thank you so much, Maha.
Thank you. And stay safe, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much, Maha. Take care now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are sadly at the end of our day here, but we have one more opportunity to break bread together and talk about our collective learnings from the day, what we've been able to glean, what kinds of questions are left, and I think most importantly, what are some practical next steps that we can take. I think we've heard ideas from many people today. I know, there were two other streams aside from the one that I was sitting in, where there's just so much for us to assimilate. And so why don't we start with maybe Sai, you can offer us a few thoughts to kick us off about the day's event from your perspective.
Definitely. I would number one, thank everyone for joining all around, and exactly as you said, definitely a lot of conversation, a lot of thought.
The sound is really garbled.
For us to assimilate. And so,
can you hear me, Richard?
I muted Richard because of some of the background noise he was getting.
Okay, gotcha. So definitely, it's been a journey throughout the day, to say the least. I know definitely Richard wanted to share some thoughts in particular before we dive into a broader debrief. So I don't know if Richard, you can unmute yourself, or how the background noise might be playing into it.
Okay. Well, look, I want to thank Sai for just letting me say a couple words.
So definitely, it's been a journey throughout the day.
I was going to say.
I know definitely Richard wanted to share some thoughts in particular before we dive into a broader.
If I may, I think somebody might have their stream on from the other system.
I think that's Richard, actually. Yeah. So Richard, if you could turn off the stream from YouTube or Facebook, that'll get rid of the latency effect.
So definitely, it's been a journey throughout the day.
I was going to say.
I know definitely Richard wanted to share some thoughts in particular before we dive into a broader.
If I may, I think somebody might have their stream on from the other system.
I think that's Richard, actually.
Is that better?
Any chance that's on yours, Todd? Everybody else is muted.
No, that's not on my side.
Okay.
Richard, why don't you go ahead and try to start again?
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine. Sai was very kind to let me just say a couple of words to you fellas. I was going to say it was an exciting day, but it's kind of a platitude. I think it's been a wonderful learning experience. I want to compliment you all. I'm quite sure that a lot of people are eager to experiment with the thoughts that they heard today. And one thing I just wanted to mention, again, about my wife, but she always encouraged her clients to be experimentors. And that was with an OR at the end of the word rather than an ER. And the reason is that when we're not just coaches or consultants or managers, but we're the mentors of our clients and our associates as we encourage them to look at their world differently. And so the only words I wanted to say was we all should continue to be experimentors. It's so rewarding. I just want to thank Sai. I have an issue that's popped up and I have to go. But gentlemen, it has been a pleasure to be here with you. I think today was wonderful, and Dr. Aziz is just off the wall. So everybody did a great job, and I very much appreciate you including me. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and so much of Judith's impact manifests every day, and especially days like this.
Did.
So thank you so much.
It was very.
Thank you.
It was encouraging and sad. So.
Yes, completely with you, Richard. You know how much I love you, and you know how much I love Judith. So thank you both so much.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Peace be with you.
Thank you. Todd, the debrief is in your hands, if that's all right in the group.
No, thank you. I'll just offer a couple of thoughts here. I've been jotting disparate notes throughout the day from all the many provocative, in a good way, interesting conversations. I think we're all looking to get into good trouble, in the words of John Lewis, by forcing ourselves to confront some things. Most notably, one of the things that kind of stuck with me from the last panel that we had was around the need to actively embrace greater diversity, not just in terms of geographical dispersion, but in racial, political, religious, to gain as many perspectives as we can to improve our own anti-fragility in the way that we approach solutions to business and society and ourselves, our own development. We started the day with a conversation on Stream 1 about what is normal anyway and how entirely contextual that is. Heard some really fascinating discussions about the difference between generalist or expert generalist, and that we've been communicating very badly with each other, that our tendencies to focus on tech innovation rather than being cross-disciplinary and collaborative with one another. And we need better ways to create value and to innovate. And I particularly liked one of the phrases that Ilka had mentioned in an early session around we need to create more serendipity, unexpected combinations of competencies. I think that feeds into that idea of pulling people together. Heard from others like Andy Simon talking about the importance of followership and not emphasizing so much leadership, but how do we teach people to be good followers that invest strength and direction in the vision that's expressed by leaders. Talking about establishing new habits being so important for people, and coming up with new habits in the new post-normal or abnormal or transnormal world in which we find ourselves. I like one of the things that Ilka left us with which is learn to like surprises. That's absolutely one of the places that we are now in this revolutionary time of, in the words of Michelle Walker, gray rhinos, where there are expected and very dangerous challenges for us on the horizon, and we cannot merely be complacent about denying them or muddling our way through over time. And finally, from the conversation with Maha, we had her points, which I thought fit in very well, that we need to reimagine our institutions, whether these are social contracts or whether democracy is the best formulation of government for ourselves. But we're seeing the cracks and difficulties in the foundations of a lot of these institutions which were here. So those are a few of the things that I've seen. I'd love to get the perspectives of others who were on the call here today, and as well as comments from anyone that happens to be watching in our audience. Scott, why don't I turn over to you first and see if you've had any particular thoughts you'd like to share.
Sure. Thank you, Todd. And thanks again to you and Barry and Sai and all the others that worked hard to put this together. I'd like to point out that, the three very, very articulate, bright, deep thinking women were our keynotes. And between Amanda and Michelle and Maha, we had just a terrific representation of what diversity should mean to us and what we should be able to tap into if we are willing to listen. So I was absolutely astounded by the depth of each of those people's thinking. The one takeaway, and there were thousands, again, I mentioned at the beginning of this that my head was exploding after the last session, and I think I've gone nuclear now. It's just I got notes on my notes, and I don't know how I can process this. I hope that the micro workshops will help go a little bit deeper into each of these topics. I tried to jump around a little bit. Maybe that was a mistake. I had at one point all three streams going, and maybe that's why I've got a headache now. But a takeaway that I got here was that we can't do this by ourselves, that we need to seek help. And that was constant through all three of the tracks, whether we're talking about our own selves, whether we're talking about our businesses, whether we're talking about the global community. We can't do this ourselves. So we need to be seeking help through technology, through training, through mentorship and coaches. And of course, my theme is that we can seek peers. And I was gratified to hear Amanda talk about her peer group and how important that was to her. I think we should all find a peer group that we can resonate with. A couple of other things that that grabbed me. I loved Professor Baran's statement that we never sweep a staircase from the bottom step, and we need to start from the top, and that resonates. As a pilot, I also resonated with the statement that we've lost our checklist. We don't have we need to develop a new checklist of things that make us feel comfortable and things that we can touch on and hold to. I also heard Andrea Rotolo say that our job needs to become our mission. And I think that's an important thing to think about. And she ended her session with "Know thyself, and the time is now." So I'll end it the same way.
Thank you so much, Scott. And Ciprian, would you like to go next?
Okay, there are three, let's say, verbs that are into my mind right now at the end. Finish, connect, experiment. I had to finish the feast we have today in terms of insights and ideas and people. I have a long watch list of the other conference. I moderate 2 panels, and I plan to finish this and take each dish aside, if I'm allowed to call a dish, all these wonderful speakers and their wonderful ideas. Second, I plan to connect with many people because I saw many inspiring people I would love to keep closer. And 3, experiment, maybe to try something that I haven't done so far from all these ideas. Maybe I will take something that will inspire from the feast and I will do it. Maybe I will go to a micro workshop. From what I watched, I was in a panel of agility, anti-fragility, and there is a clear common area of all the speakers that we need somehow to develop, train, coach behaviors. And these behaviors goes into leadership, but also followership. There is a high demand of changing behavior, and there are tools and people who can do it. Behaviors both in agility and anti-fragility. I was extremely inspired by Mahaziz. It's the first time I saw her live, so I'm impressed by the deep insight of her keynote. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful being part of this.
Very good. Miguel, would you care to add some thoughts?
Yeah, I would say I'm very grateful to have been part of this because I had a pretty limited intervention, although I was really passionate by what my speakers had to say. And what I keep out of this conversation is, if we want to shake the rules of the economy today and give another place to humanity tomorrow, we have to rebalance our priorities. And I think they said something we have all to keep in mind and consider, for example, green business opportunities and all the raising trends about climate, like opportunities for tomorrow. They said planet first, humans second, because we live on this planet, and profit third, meaning that instead of having I would say, shareholder logic as a prominent paradigm, we should shift and have the profit as a consequence of our actions, meaning that our business models need probably to be human-centric and consider they are successful because they are viable as producing profits, but not putting profit in the first place if we want to reshape our future and give sense to it. So I think this is a pretty strong message. I also believe that it repositions the leaders into a different way, meaning that we don't need, or probably we aspire of having a different type of leaders, not charismatic leaders, not leaders having necessarily a vision, but leaders able to exploit or unlock the potential of people. People who can, let's say, unlock the potential out of a diversity of a diverse group of people. And this is what we need. As said, for tomorrow. These are the few words I keep on going, and I think that this will bring some new inspiration about what we can promote in terms of evolution for a community.
Thank you, Miguel. And Whit, would you care to add some reflections from the day?
Just to be additive, the big theme that stayed in my mind was the number of times I've heard in different groups talk about uncertainty in terms of internal, external. And I thought it was really a really important one. The idea being is there actually were two different paradigms being discussed. One is that there is no internal, external, there's only internal, we make it all up. And the other one was that they're there. And I see people balancing them, but always that there are these practical ideas that were being shared by a lot. So I'm not going to say more because you all can add more to that, but it was a very impressive presentations. I loved them all, and I thought it was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Whit. And then finally, I'll turn things over to Barry, and then we'll conclude with Sai.
Great, thank you so much. Well, what a tremendous day, 5 hours. And at first, when we were doing it, I was thinking it was going to go too quick. On the other hand, there was so much great information in there. And I went to the different streams. I look forward to the recordings. First of all, I want to say that there was over 60 different speakers and moderators, which is a tremendous piece. The feeling I got, thank you for mentioning that about the certainty and uncertainty of it. The biggest takeaway that I got is that what was normal is the new normal. There is no new normal. It's we have some baseline and it's changing all the time. And I think usually it changes fairly slow on the big scale of life. It's changing so quickly, we individuals around the world don't know what to do with it. So it's stepping into a new way of being and being anti-fragile, being flexible, being able to change with the flow and the tide so quickly that you don't know how quick it's going. That was my overall big takeaway. I like the diversity and the flexibility of the different speakers, the panelists, male, female, around the world, all sorts of different viewpoints. So that humbles my heart. So one of the questions that comes up is, what's next? How do we take this 5 hours of amazing material and do something with it? And many of you have heard myself and others talk about micro workshops. So we just want to take a couple of quick minutes to mention that. I'm going to bring up my screen share, and let's see how we do this here. Not sure. I might know. Let me get to the application window. Okay, so you should see my screen share now. Do you see that okay, Todd? Coming up. How do you see my screen?
Yep, there you go.
Okay, I don't know how I actually scroll through it, but there we go. On the Catalyzing the Future website, there's a tab for micro workshops. You can go look at them later. What they are is a fast-paced 90-minute interactive opportunities to share perspectives, explore insights, discover guidance for making practical impact on your group organization. So they're going to be 90 minutes, and they're going to be highly interactive with breakout groups. They're going to be priced affordably, and we're going to have them starting in October. They're going to be kicking off in October, November, December, which is the last quarter here this year, and then we're going to be rolling a lot of them into next year. Currently, we have 11 different presenters with 23 different workshops. There are a number more that are coming in. So We hope that you take advantage of these. They're going to be very powerful, and it's a great way to put it into practice. It's one thing to go to a great workshop or conference like this one. It's another thing to then take it and put it into action, so it's not just hanging out there. If you have more ideas for the workshops, please contact myself or Sai. You have our email addresses. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Sai to close this out. Over there to you, Sai.
Thank you so much. There's not much more to say other than thank you all around. Gratitude to the keynotes, the panelists, the moderators, the hosts, the participants, all the people who were not here at the close, amongst other places. Deep gratitude for all of that. And where we go next, exactly as Barry said, and we continue to build the future and catalyze the future together. So hope you and yours stay safe, well, and healthy. Thank you.
And I believe that concludes our day. Thank you for joining us for the broadcast. And if you would like to catch any of the replays, we invite you to visit us on catalyzingthefuture.com, as well as going to our social media websites and catch any of the replayed streams that you may have happened to miss. With that, we conclude our broadcast, and we wish you all a good day, good evening, and look forward to interacting with you in future events and at the micro workshops.